when they actually spend their time listening to this show. What does it mean? It means we're winning.
I'm white, and I've got everything I need. No one clutches their purses when they're in a room alone with me. And I can drive for any neighborhood I please at any hour, and the police don't do a thing. So if I see a penny on the ground, I leave it alone and fucking flip it. I'm a straight white male in America. I got everything I need. I'm a guy getting paid more than a girl with a degree. And I can walk down the streets after dark, no one wants to rape me. And I can get a girl pregnant and just as easily flee. Just like my straight white male dad did to me. So if I see a penny on the ground, I leave it alone and fucking flip it. I'm a straight white male in America. I've got all the luck I need. I've got a pile of broken mirrors and I'm walking under ladders and I'm spilling tons of salt, but to me that doesn't matter, cause my skin and my gender and my orientation are the best things to have if you live in this nation. I recommend it highly. If I see a penny on the ground, I leave it alone and fucking flip it. I'm a straight white male in America. I've got all the luck I need. Shit's gonna work out for me, cause I'm a straight white male in America. I've got all the luck I need.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Intellectual Dollar Tree. We do the show live every Wednesday, 7 p.m. Pacific. Right here at twitch.tv/Echoplex Media. If you're listening for the first time on the podcast, we're sorry, but also follow the podcast on the podcatcher you're checking us out on, or if you prefer a different one. And I don't know, text it to your friend. I'm Producer Dave, and you can find me actually on port87.social. I'm just at Dave over there, so pretty easy to find.
And I am HK Perrin. You can find me also on port87.social, which is a Mastodon instance. So if you have Mastodon, just type into the search browser at hperrin at port87.social.
And we don't usually talk about this, but good on Justin for sending all of his viewers our way. We just got a raid here on Twitch. 24 goats. Good way to start the show off. Yeah, I guess that's it. Fucking, you can support us at echoplexmedia.com. Just click that support tab, and maybe you should wait till the end of the podcast to decide if that's something you'd want to do. You know, you can make your own decisions, I suppose. So what we have this week is usually there's no one to root for on the Intellectual Dollar Tree, but a friend of the show, Chris Kavanaugh, actually spoke with Konstantin Kissin from Triggernometry. And it was a pretty, I've never seen Konstantin subjected to criticism before, so this is pretty good. Unfortunately, there's no video for this. It's an audio-only podcast. We're going to be running it from YouTube, so you'll get a static image. So if someone just joins us, they'll know what we're covering. And I guess, here we go.
Today with us, we have Konstantin Kissin from the Triggernometry podcast. So podcast host and comedian. I guess Konstantin is that
comedian is like whatever. I guess he's just being polite to his guests.
I haven't done stand-up since the pandemic started. So a comedian in retirement or on a break or whatever it is. I still write a lot of satirical stuff.
I believe the correct phrase is aspiring comedian who gave up.
Podcaster, comedian, satirist, whatever you want.
Yes, and I think you're based in England, right?
That sounds threatening. That sounds threatening in your accent, but yes, it's. I confess, guilty.
Oh, comedian.
I lived in London for I guess about 10 years, so I'm familiar with
That
that.
sounds
neck of the
threatening
woods,
in your
but
accent.
not
Is that
based there now. So
is that okay?
Konstantin kindly agreed to come on because I think we talked a while back about potentially having a discussion about like areas that we might agree or disagree on. And then I listened to your recent appearance on Joe Rogan, and some of the same issues that I thought would be useful to discuss came up, and you kindly agreed to. And broadly speaking, I would say, I don't know how familiar you are with our podcast, but we tend to focus on online gurus or secular gurus. So this is people that fall into the Jordan Peterson, Nassim Taleb. We've also done Ibram Kendi and who's that guy that the science writer, Matt, that we like? Your hero.
Not okay. I was going to say Kelsey.
No, not L. Ron Hubbard.
I gotta say, you guys treat your guests with a lot of respect. I love it.
Yeah, well, so
Comedy.
just to highlight that we do try.
Is that what that's supposed to be?
Widely across the guru sphere as it exists, but we do have a tendency to focus on the kind of IDW heterodox sphere, in part because that's where a lot of the most dramatic, bombastic style gurus are, the Weinsteins, for example. But in any case, one of the things that we've come across quite often is that people within the heterodox sphere tend to see a much bigger concern emanating from the mainstream institutions and mainstream media sources, and have less of a concern about the kind of alternative ecospheres and guru figures that we talk about. So I thought it might be good to talk about the relative problems in each of the spheres and where, you know.
Did his static image just blink?
His static image just blinked. You don't understand comedy, HK.
Ugh.
This is so creepy. I feel some kind of way about that. Maybe we should change the
Man, why would you do that?
We might disagree with
comedy.
Yours. So maybe it would be useful just to start if you kind of outlined where you're coming from or where you see your position being, you know, in the online discourse or commentary space or whatever you want to call it.
It's a very big and open question, I suppose. So the way I self-identify is a kind of enlightened centrist. I don't.
Oh, that's not a good way to self-identify. Also, don't you people hate people that self-identify as something or another? I identify as enlightened. I think. Thank you very much. It's like, oh, really? Are you delusional? Like, I think you can have enlightened positions on certain matters, but if you just decide that you yourself are enlightened, that's crazy talk, right?
I think he might be joking.
Oh, that's right. He's a comedian. I keep forgetting.
Is he joking?
I've watched so much of his stuff.
Or does he actually think of himself as like a centrist who's so centered on everything that he's enlightened?
I've watched so much of his stuff and I just keep forgetting that he's a comedian, and you have to consider the fact that what he's telling you might be like a very unfunny joke.
Yep.
I'm not interested in partisanship or party politics at all. In fact,
I don't think he was joking.
Party political, it boggles my mind. It's like how you could wed yourself permanently to one side of the political spectrum in hugely varying circumstances. I find strange that people are willing to do that.
But is that what it's like to be like partisans? Because we're generally partisans, right? You probably voted party line Democrat, right?
Yep.
But it doesn't mean I'm like wedded to the some specific group in every circumstance. It's just like when I get my ballot, I'm like, damage report. Like, who is the least crazy? What is the least crazy thing I could do with each of these fucking things that are being proposed to me?
And like, you know, I'll usually vote straight Democrat for people, but for like the the propositions, I don't necessarily vote straight Democrat. Like I've gone against the Democrats on something that they supported that I opposed, or something they opposed that I supported.
Sure. But yeah, but basically when you get your ballot, it's like damage report.
I don't think anyone is like that much of a partisan. Like even like the chairman of the DNC is probably not that much of a partisan.
Maybe they are, because that's their job, but that's like different than their individual views too, right? You can separate out what they do for work than like how they actually view the world. They sometimes there couldn't be a way in which, if you were the chair of the Democratic Party, that sometimes you didn't toe a line you didn't fully believe in, because it's your job. But that's different. Yeah, it's interesting. Like the way that the way that enlightened centrists describe people who are typically conservative or liberal is just absurd.
Yep.
But yeah, he wasn't joking. He like literally thinks that he's like devoid of bias, left or right.
Yeah. By the way, if this thing blinks while we're paused, I'm fucking leaving.
And the direction they've taken, I hope that hasn't prevented me from being an equally fierce critic of where the alt media is going wrong, and the war in Ukraine and the way some of the supposedly heterodox people are covering that is something I've been calling out from the moment that it started, because that is an issue I understand pretty well, being half Russian, half Ukrainian, having grown up in both countries, etc. So when I see people going off the deep end on that issue, I haven't been shy about calling that out. But yes, that's I guess.
But that's like a thing that they don't even really. We've never seen them talk about that on Triggernometry. Like the war in Ukraine is like fairly new, considering how long his podcast has been around, and for him to jump to that one, it's telling, because most of his content is culture war shit.
Yep.
So that
anti-wokeness.
Yeah, that's like almost all of his content, and so it's just really telling that he wants to kind of immediately jump to the one thing where he sort of disagrees with the heterodox people.
I see myself as being somewhere in the center, looking at both extremes and going, "You're both crazy."
Yes, that's what centrism is. It's where you fucking, on the ideological playing field, you pick a spot where you're like, I stand here, and you're like, okay, let's get an ivory tower delivered. And so a fucking helicopter comes in, drops a fucking ivory tower, and then you climb up on it, and you look down, and you go, look at all these idiots. God, imagine like doing that. Like, it's crazy town.
And also, being a centrist in one culture is not the same as being a centrist in world politics.
And I also I'm willing to believe someone who tells me they're a moderate, because they're going to tell me that they're a conservative, right? But but I'm moderate. I'm not like real, I'm a conservative, but I'm moderate. I don't get into this culture war shit. I actually tend to agree with the liberals on culture war ideas, and I want to leave people alone. I believe that person.
Yeah.
I don't believe somebody who, like, without any sense of the irony or the stupidity of what they're telling me, tells me that they're an enlightened centrist.
In terms of the mainstream and the alt media, I mentioned, some of the areas where I think the alt media can go wrong. I do think you have to be careful when you're comparing institutions or systems of communicating information. I'm going to sound very woke here, but it's kind of like stupidity plus power. Like, if a guy on a YouTube channel with 30 followers is saying something really stupid, I'm less concerned about that than I am about a mainstream publication saying something equally stupid, because the reach...
I mean, us too, we push that to like 11:30 or midnight here on the intellectual Dollar Tree.
Bigger. And so I do think the mainstream media, which for the moment still has a much bigger reach and therefore more influence, should be subject to more scrutiny. But apart from that, I don't know if that gives you enough to start sticking pins in me.
Yeah. So I know, for example, that you had run-ins with James Lindsay over Ukraine before his ignoble exit from Twitter discourse, and I think in general you have been in the trenches over the Ukraine conflict. Even actually on the Rogan appearance, I I noted that, he was more skeptical about the validity of sending arms to support Ukraine or American involvement, and you push back a little, which I think is to your credit. But so I guess from what you said, the value of like being able to criticize people on both sides of the political spectrum, and including people that might agree with you, is something that you would.
You don't have to be a centrist to be able to criticize people on both sides.
Right. We make fun of dumb liberals all the time here.
Yeah.
Like Sam Harris
is that what this is about?
Sam Harris claims to be a liberal, and we make fun. We make so much fun of him that we have almost a whole soundboard of him.
Like, does maybe the enlightened centrist folk believe that they can't criticize anyone unless they, I don't know. A lot of them at least lean somewhere. So
I don't. The enlightened centrist thing, I can't believe he unironically called himself that. That's like a joke. I thought that was a joke that people told, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Ukraine is just the latest example. So I've been very clear, for example, that even though because of some of the people that I've interviewed, there are a lot of people that think I'm massively on the Trump trend. And I have friends who are big Trump supporters. I'm good friends with someone who used to work for Donald Trump at a high level. But I'm very clear that I was very clear on January the 7th, on the morning of January the 7th, when appearing on the Lotus Eaters podcast with Francis, that I thought what happened.
That is just if anybody doesn't know what the Lotus Eaters podcast, Sargon of Akkad.
A complete abomination and completely wrong to the, let's just say, dissatisfaction of many of the people in his audience.
But like, where was he on January 5th? When like all the bullshit that he was spewing was bubbling all this stuff up. Where was he then? Well, like, it's only when things actually got violent that he was like, oh, maybe all this violent rhetoric isn't good.
Well, to be fair, I would think he was more platforming and like nodding along with people talking about like the election being stolen, to the extent that those kind of guests were even on. Because this kind of guests were people like Brett Weinstein. His guests are just grifters, right? They're not like didn't have like Steve Bannon on or Alex Jones or anybody who was really pushing. Like, he doesn't have like a lot of Republican partisans on his show. He has people, definitely has more like the kinds of people we cover on this show or his guest list.
Okay.
And so he didn't, I don't know if he was pushing that lie. Plus he's not even an American. So there's like maybe not even an incentive for him to do that because he's Great Britain.
He's talking about like, I'm not fully on the Trump train. And his example is like, on January 7th, I got off the Trump train. It's like,
well,
really?
I don't think that's what he said, but I don't think that we had ever seen clips of him advocating for Donald Trump, but I don't remember seeing him criticize either. But to me, that's neither here nor there because he lives in London and so he doesn't vote in the United States, right? So like, if he just didn't say anything about it, then that would be perfectly fine. I don't have a problem with that.
Yeah.
Hesitant to criticize either side when they're doing something wrong. I just see that the threat from I don't like the word woke anymore because it was co-opted and now it's been re-co-opted but the threat from the progressive left, particularly in the reaction it will trigger from the right, is to me a far bigger concern.
Wait a minute. So he's saying that the problem with the progressive left is actually the fact that it will trigger a violent reaction from the right?
That sounds like more of a problem with the right to me.
It's like if like the progressive left is like advocating for policy and more tolerance and, inclusion for trans people, which is sort of the hot button issue in the culture war still, and that's going to trigger a violent reaction from a bunch of crazy people. The problem was with a bunch of crazy people.
Yeah, that seems pretty fucking clear cut to me. Like,
It's like the why are you hitting yourself of political arguments that he just made.
Than some of the other stuff. So that's why I've been a vocal critic of that, because I think it's very, very dangerous.
Yeah, so I guess one of the points that I would raise is that whenever I listen, and we listen to a lot of content where people are being critical about the, institutions or the kind of social justice left or progressive left, or however you want to frame it. And one thing that often seems to go unmentioned in those conversations is, first of all, that there is a very large receptive audience for critiques of those mainstream positions and of social progressivism on the right. And those tend to be not what you're talking about with like small YouTube channels. You have huge media entities, you have national newspapers, and you have like channels dedicated to pumping out right-wing takes. And I often see that if it is recognized, like just kind of gestured at that there is right-wing media, but the right-wing media is like a huge ecosystem. And in terms of disinformation or, kind of pumping out partisan rhetoric, it seems equally, if not much more guilty than the left-wing media ecosystems. If you're looking at Breitbart or the Epoch Times or the Fox News, there's definitely a very strong tolerance there for partisan positions. So I wonder, in those terms, I rarely see that, like on Joe Rogan, that's very rarely discussed, for example. And do you think that is a case of there being just more of a focus on the issues of the left, or why does the right wing ecosystem tend to get a pass in heterodox spaces?
I don't think that it gets a pass. I just think to liberal people like me and Joe, the idea that Fox News is full of bullshit.
Wait, you just said that you were an enlightened centrist. Now you're liberal like Joe Rogan. What? Hey, dude. Hey, dude. Try to keep your bullshit straight.
I'm just a centrist liberal right winger,
Like, it's just try to keep your bullshit straight, dude. Come on.
Right-wing propaganda is taken as given. I've been on Fox News once, I think. I don't consider it to be an objective source of information, just like I don't consider CNN to be an objective source of information.
The one thing I wish Chris would have done here has been like, well, where would you find an objective source of information?
Yeah. But he also said Fox News just like CNN, and that's just not true.
Right, they're not the same. It's like they both have problems, but that doesn't mean they're the same, right? Like,
yeah, like they both skew to one direction, but one actively makes its viewers less informed.
Well, that's according to the liberals that made the poll, HK.
I guess so.
However, when you talk about the ecosystems being equal, I wouldn't agree with that. I mean, I went on Twitter this morning and I saw a tweet from Joe Biden talking about how he was basically criticizing the right. But what he was saying is we have a situation where people either, if there's an election, either they win or they believe that the election was stolen. And this is treated as a perfectly reasonable thing for Joe Biden to say.
But he's a politician. He's going to say he's a partisan politician. He's going to come out and say partisan things to like try to influence people to like his party. That's like a part of his job as the president. Even if what he said is totally like partisan and hyped up to 11, which I don't think what he said is like actually that even super controversial after what we saw on January 6th, which he himself said was horrifying.
Yeah. But like there are candidates who are saying literally that.
And
too.
And they were mentioning the media system. I'm sorry. Is Joe Biden a fucking media outlet? He's the president of the United States. He's going to go out.
He has a big megaphone, but he is not a media outlet.
And he's going to go out and say politically charged things because he's a fucking politician. Like what? Like that's his job. Like what a dumb thing to say.
Even though it's very clear that the mainstream media spent 4 years after the election of Donald Trump in 2016 lying endlessly about his election, the reasons for his election, claiming it was Russia collusion, Russia interference, Russia, to the point where at the time even I believed it. And one of my reasons for being so disenchanted with the mainstream is how much they've been lying.
Well, the government said that there was Russian interference in the election.
Right. They just like the end of the report, the end of the Mueller report basically said, you know, we just can't bring charges. They basically said Congress has to do this because we can't really charge a sitting president with things because that's been the way that it's been done.
That was for obstruction of justice, but for collusion, they said, yes, there was Russian interference with the election, but we have no proof that Donald Trump colluded in that interference.
Right. But
so like you could say that like Donald Trump had nothing to do with the interference, but denying that there was interference at all is just disagreeing with everyone who's ever studied it.
And like suggesting that every country on the planet that has the means isn't trying to put their thumb on the scale in other countries' politics is fucking stupid. We have whole departments of the government dedicated to that. In the USA, it's called the CIA. Like
yeah,
there are
in this case, Russia spent a lot of time and a lot of effort to sway the results of that election.
Or what I've kind of learned is that they were fine either way as long as they could like turn up the temperature. That was like most of this. They were funding, like they were putting up, I don't want to get too into the weeds on this, but they were putting up like event pages for demonstrations, both right wing and left wing demonstrations in the same place, like to try to like sow chaos and whatnot. I don't think that they necessarily, and I don't know, I'm not a Russian intelligence operative and I don't have access to them. But I think in the end, they didn't care what the result of that election was. If they could sow chaos, it's good for them.
I think they did because,
well,
Trump was objectively much more friendly to Russia than Hillary would have been. But like denying that any interference from Russia took place at all is just denying reality. So I don't know why he's saying like, the fact that media outlets were reporting on reality makes them untrustworthy. Like, I just disagree. That doesn't make them untrustworthy.
Maybe all he caught was Rachel Maddow, who I think did a horrible job during all of that. Ramping everything, like speculating, saying things that weren't true on her show. Maybe he's talking about that stuff, but like that wasn't the majority of the media. And there was also like the Fox News is legacy media, and they were basically saying that nothing happened.
Yeah.
So it wasn't the whole media. It was just like you were saying, fact-based media. They were most of the time they were just reporting on what was being discovered. I don't know. I stayed away from all that stuff because there were so many things that were unknowable that I didn't want to end up saying a bunch of dumb shit about some stuff I don't know about. I stayed out of it.
Joe Biden can go out and say that, and no one is going to flag up his tweet for misinformation in the way that they would do with someone on the right if they tweeted something like this. So I think the idea that there's an equal and opposite echo chamber is untrue. I think the number of outlets and how seriously they're taken by the ordinary person is completely different. If I was to give a normie friend of mine, quote unquote, an article from Fox News, the way they would treat that would be very different to an article from The Guardian, even though in my experience, they're both equally as inaccurate as each other. And in some cases, The Guardian is more inaccurate and the bullshit that they're peddling is worse. And so I think that to present these as equally significant is inaccurate, in my opinion.
So in that case, Konstantin, like one thing I'd push back on though, I listened to Rogan's podcast and we've covered him in a couple of episodes, and it's not accurate to kind of present Joe as having just a complete wide variety of perspectives in terms of political takes. Generally speaking, he tends to be more in line in modern terms with the right-wing positions, like the conservative right. I mean, the politicians that he is in favor of are like DeSantis and
Bernie Sanders.
But with Bernie Sanders, Joe said that he would possibly vote for him in the primary. And then when it was...
And that was like that was like 2015 or some shit that he had Bernie Sanders on. Like, it's been a very long time.
You got to reach real far back.
Presented as an endorsement. He himself clarified he wasn't endorsing, just saying he liked Bernie.
Right.
But
he had Bernie Sanders on the show, and he had Cornel West on the show, who's a radical leftist professor. I'm not, by the way, I wouldn't...
But these things were like such a long time ago.
They also weren't Joe Rogan's beliefs. Like he was saying Joe Rogan's beliefs align with the Republicans. And for the most part, they do. I mean, not always. He has some beliefs that don't align with Republicans. And I'm sure, if Konstantin were talking to me right now, he would be bringing them up as the only example.
Well, right, and I'd just like to separate out, like, I don't know actually what his fucking beliefs are. I just know what he says. And he says things right now that align with, like, the sort of anti-woke culture war side of the Republican Party.
Yep, if you take him at face value.
Yeah.
That Joe's show is entirely politically balanced. No show can be. And I am not pretending that Joe is a left-winger. I think by the current conception, in the current climate, I think he would be center-right on most of his politics. Although I think I pissed him off a lot by saying that open borders is a really stupid idea. I heard him later talking about how maybe it's a good idea. So I don't know what his take is on that. But I don't think presenting him as conservative is at all the correct way of presenting his views.
Yeah, I think that probably Matt and I have a slightly different perspective, although we'd agree with you. There are various issues where, like people are complex. They have, different takes. And Joe has a famous clip where he took Dave Rubin to task about the need for regulation, right?
And Candace Owens on the green stuff and others. Joe is someone who seeks the truth, and he's willing to challenge people when he disagrees.
So
hard disagree on that.
Yeah, hard disagree.
There are exceptions.
He's willing to challenge people when he disagrees, but it's like he had like he had a person on who was pro-vaccine, and he challenged that person because he disagreed. But like you don't see him, like you saw him going after Dave Rubin on building codes because what Dave Rubin said was fucking stupid, and Joe Rogan like had just had his studio built by like professionals who built him a good studio that isn't dangerous. And so he was like, well, no, actually, when you get this stuff done, you hire professionals because they follow building codes. But that's like the lowest hanging fruit is like taking Dave Rubin to task for saying something dumb on your show.
But also, Joe Rogan doesn't seek the truth. Like, he has people on that essentially just say absolute falsehoods, and he won't challenge them on it because, he's not an expert. And he also won't have experts in the field on.
Not anymore.
I mean, sometimes he does, but he'll have someone on who's talking about like some ridiculous take on something that like scientifically we very much know about. And he won't have like a scientist who actually studies that thing on to clarify where this person's making a mistake or anything they get wrong.
Like, right, if he has a scientist on, it's like an astrophysicist or like an AI person or, something that isn't like a hot button issue. So that it's like it's like a more galaxy brain kind of thing, right? He doesn't have like virologists, addiction medicine specialists, infectious disease specialists. He's not going to have on a climate change, somebody who studies the climate, a climate change person. It's going to be like, it's going to be like somebody who found a black hole somewhere. And sure, that's fucking rad, right? But it doesn't balance. He doesn't have any black hole truthers on his show.
And what I mean to say is, like, when he has a scientist on, it's just him talking to the scientist. But when he has someone on who's like some denier, who's denying some scientific fact, like a vaccine denier or something, he won't have a vaccine scientist on there to be like, well, here's why this person is wrong. This study proves this person wrong. This is why we know that they're wrong. And, you know, here's a video of a microscope showing that they're wrong.
But like not an outright polemicist, but I think if you take a look at Joe's content over time, and especially during the COVID period, it's heavily leans towards the right-wing narrative, and not lightly so, because we covered his episodes with Robert McCulloch and Peter McCulloch and Robert Malone, and the level of kind of endorsement of conspiracism around COVID, it wasn't a light asking questions. It was not too far from Majid Nawaz, and those figures were introducing that the pandemic had been planned by the authorities, that the amount of deaths were being covered up, that people with bullet wounds to the head were being counted so doctors could profit, that no doctors were interested in curing the disease, and so on. And these were quite extreme positions. And then Joe made it clear on that he saw it as his duty to kind of promote these people that were being silenced. And that to me is not taking, you know, I'm just going to see both sides and ask, because when Joe had on figures that were pro-vaccine, and there was much less of them, but when he did have them on, it was a grilling of, you know, taking them to task. And that is not what happened with the people who were anti-vaccine. So I know that's a specific example, but I think that Joe and other figures in the heterodox spheres have a tendency to retreat to, we're just asking questions and having a debate, when the reality is more advancing a specific narrative. And often that narrative is on the right. And I actually think it's perfectly fine for that to be the case, but just it feels like it should be acknowledged more than it is.
So I agree with you on a lot of what you said, and I disagree on some of what you said. So what I agree with you is, I do think when we had the peak of lockdown and vaccine enforcement and talk about mandates and all of this stuff, I do think during that period, the people that Joe had on and the way that he talked to them, you accurately describe, in that he was more to one side than the other, and the way that guests from one side were treated was different to the guests from the other side. Where I don't agree with you is, first of all, I don't see those issues as being right versus left at all. There were plenty of people on the left who were leaning more in the direction of people like Robert Malone and people.
Gross, it blinked again.
Many apolitical people too.
I missed it that time.
So I wouldn't see that issue as right and left, even though I agree with the premise of what you say. And I said at the time,
like, if you're going to put up animations, put up animations. But if you're going to put like a static image, don't fucking animate it.
Add them on, and I'll tell you why. I don't know. I didn't discuss this with you.
Maybe he was just actually sitting there for this. And he only just blinks once every 5 minutes. Maybe he's one of the lizard people.
So I don't know why he made the choices that he made. But from my perspective, the biggest issue that was happening at the time was the idea that government must censor people for having these discussions. That we must prevent people.
No, they were getting kicked off of social media, dude. The government wasn't coming and fucking throwing anybody in jail.
Yes, as I recall, the only time the government stepped in was when Alex Jones started defaming people.
To be fair, that's they filed the charges against him. That's a civil suit. The government is only there to adjudicate.
Yeah, fair enough.
From having these conversations. And to me, that's a very dangerous idea. I don't agree with this at all. And I was relieved that the most powerful podcaster in the world was forcing the government to essentially take note of the fact that they don't have that option if that is what they're trying to pursue. So while I disagreed with some of his guest choices and I disagreed with the balance, you know, I actually, when he said I'd like to have people from the other side on, I suggested a couple of people to him that I thought would put the balance view. You know,
but also like things don't have to be a balance. Like, if you have one person on that's saying, like, yeah, the Holocaust, it was real bad, like, just exceptionally bad, and we should never do one of those again, then you shouldn't be like, maybe I should have a pro-Holocaust voice on my show. It's like, no, you don't fucking need one. There are some things that it's just fine to not have a balance on.
What you're talking about is balance in place of objectivity.
Yes.
Just because you've presented both sides of an argument doesn't mean that you've even if you give completely equal time, excuse me, that doesn't mean that you're being objective. Because if the argument is like, what shape is the Earth? Well, the objective thing to do is to not have people on to debate that. Or if you do, you have it on as a you do it as a gag, because that's the objective way to like deal with that. Yeah, and I don't like, who were Konstantin's list of people? I don't know. But you know who was never going to be on there to talk during all this? He would have never had Stephen Novella, Bob Novella, David Gorski, fucking any of those people like who do or are in the fucking trenches on the other side.
Yep.
Because that's like who needed, like, if there was going to be the counterpoint on there, it needed to not only be like somebody who is a medical doctor or a virologist, but somebody who understands conspiracism and how these tropes work. Like, if you remember, Sanjay Gupta went on there and didn't do so well. I would have done better than Sanjay Gupta, because I wouldn't have focused on the medical data or whatever. Well, first of all, Sanjay Gupta is now a talking head, which is a perfectly fine thing to be, but he also wasn't like he's not like up to speed on all the stuff because he's not in like doing the research, but he also doesn't understand conspiracism. So like, if it would have been better for him, like ideally it would have been somebody with both, somebody like Gorski or one of the Novella brothers, right? But he had Sanjay Gupta on, who was just not prepared for the fucking like barrage of bullshit he was going to be subjected to.
Yep.
Me out and never talk to me again. Do you know what I mean? Like he's open to hearing people's ideas. So the main point of disagreement with you is I don't think it's right versus left. And number two, I don't necessarily see the job of the alt media is as always being balanced. The job of the alt media is to provide balance. So these are very different things. So if the mainstream media refuses to do something, then Joe Rogan or Triggernometry or whoever may do that thing. And then they both look unbalanced. But what we are trying to do...
The mainstream media is refusing to report that the Earth is flat. So instead, we're going to report that the Earth is flat so that we're providing balance.
Also, separating Joe Rogan out from mainstream media is just a fucking category error.
Yeah, true.
Because they'll, on one hand, be like, oh, he's the alternative media. And then, like, fucking... maybe not him, maybe not Konstantin specifically, but some of those same people will be like, well, he does bigger numbers than CNN. And it's like, well, then which is it?
Yeah.
That's why, like, I prefer like to say like legacy media, because that's like a more accurate description of what CNN, NBC, even Fox, they've been around for quite some time. You know what I'm saying? I feel like that's a better description. NPR, The Guardian, BBC is like a better descriptor than mainstream versus alt, because I mean, one could make the argument that David Pakman is almost mainstream media just because of the size of his audience, right?
Yeah.
So, you know, the distinction here is kind of, I don't like the distinction the way it's being used here, and I think Chris brought it up, like in with this framing, but you know, I'm being pedantic and weird, but that's what this show is for. So I do this show so I don't get super pedantic and weird during things like the Cults show tomorrow night.
I think it's important. And in the case of the pandemic, my big issue was we mustn't force people to take a vaccine, and we mustn't censor people who have even wacky, crazy ideas about the COVID, the pandemic, or whatever, because at the end of the day, if we want
but the thing is, like, not platforming someone isn't the same as fucking censoring them. Like, that's what guys like this, like, absolutely refuse to admit. Like, he fucking knows it. Everyone knows that, like, if I mail CNN a letter saying, hey, let me on your show, I want to talk about X, and they're like, no. They're not fucking censoring me. They're just not platforming me. And platforming these crazy people is wrong. It is wrong to platform someone who has a dangerous idea, an idea that's dangerous to society.
Right.
And anti-vax people have a dangerous idea.
And I mean, not for nothing, the whole heterodox sort of IDW space is a no platform for certain people's space, right? They are, every one of them, lockstep, no platform for Sam Cedar from the Majority Report. They will platform someone with a much smaller audience than him, but no platform for him. So I don't understand like what the difference is. These people, it's a fucking straight, like, and I don't know, like one or two of them talked to David Pakman. Now there's no platform in that space for David Pakman because he, you know what I'm saying? So these people, they do the very thing they're talking about. They're just not, you know, they think that Twitter is the government or something, that the government, he keeps coming back to this idea that the government's going to force you to get a vaccine. No, they're not. The government's going to censor you. No, they're not. We have some speech laws, sure. Like I can't hire a hitman, but that's not really censorship at that point. That's like preventing a murder. So,
yes.
Right.
And also, like, why shouldn't we force people to get the vaccine?
I don't want to, I'm not even going to, we're not going down that road because it's not,
like,
because it's
under
not
certain
happening.
Circumstances, people should be forced to get the vaccine. Like students should be forced to get the vaccine if they're going to a public school.
This is a hypothetical. And we're not going down that road.
All right.
We're listening to this content. We're not going to discuss whether or not the government should by force compel people to have a vaccine.
To have these conversations openly. And so I was simultaneously not happy that certain people were being promoted and also happy that they were not being censored. I know that's a complex position and it sounds quite difficult, but that's the way that I was coming at it from. So and I think that will happen on a lot of issues. If you look at the people we had on Triggernometry during the pandemic, I think we were a lot more sensible about it. We had one guy on who was Dr. Sucharit Bhakdi, who I think people would consider very problematic. And really, it's not like we were endorsing his point of view. We wanted to hear what he had to say for himself. YouTube then banned that video and gave us a strike for that. Based on the rules, the way they updated them at the time, our interview did break the rules of YouTube, and we therefore didn't appeal it because we felt it was a fair thing for them to take.
That's amazing. What you just said is amazing. I never thought I'd hear one of these people say that.
Yeah.
Down. And after that, our own views on that issue evolved. When we had COVID, we put an episode out talking about how bad it was for both me and Francis, discussing,
But this is one of the things I don't like about like conservatives is like everything's not really a problem until it happens to them or like one of their family members. It was like how Dick Cheney was hell of against fucking gay marriage until one of his daughters was gay. And then he like really softened his position and said states should be able to decide and states should be able to legalize gay marriage if they want. And so this motherfucker, like probably had a bunch of COVID deniers on, right? And then him and Non Oliver got COVID. And then all of a sudden they were like, actually, this is really bad because it happened to them.
Mm-hmm. Dated views and all of this stuff. So, I certainly always tried to approach it from a position of honest inquiry. And my concern with all of this stuff is the mainstream media were not doing honest inquiry. They became a propaganda wing of the governments which, as we now know, were prioritizing public health over truth. And I don't believe that a government should ever do that.
So there's a bunch of points that you made there, Konstantin. I know I will say that I saw your episode where you discussed with David Fuller, and he was critical about some of the ways that you covered COVID, and it was to your credit that you had that discussion with him, and he pushed back quite forcefully, I think, and also the subsequent discussion that you had with Brett Weinstein on his podcast. Just personally speaking, it was very nice to hear someone saying that I don't have the expertise. I don't think I should be commenting.
We watched that. We put it out as a bonus. I think it was Konstantin breaks up with Brett. Because I don't think they're friends after that.
On this, and not everybody needs to issue their takes on everything. People are not experts on every topic. So I acknowledge that, you have had, I'm not saying that your position on this has been entirely, like just endorsing right-wing partisanship or that kind of thing. But some of the bits I'd push back on are when it comes to figures like Malone and McCulloch and the kind of anti-vaccine movement. Although traditionally there's been opposition on the left and right, particularly the kind of health and wellness left side of things. And the anti-vaccine movement has traditionally had a lot of support from kind of mullahs who link it to autism because of Andrew Wakefield and that kind of thing, right? So, but I would definitely say in COVID era, there is a strong right skew to anti-vaccine sentiment, and that you can see this by the fact that most of the figures who you're talking about not getting a hearing in mainstream media are regular contributors now to right-wing media. Fox News, or in most cases of the people that appear in Joe Rogan's show, InfoWars as well, which is like...
May I pause you just for 1 second? I don't mean to derail you at all. I would agree with you in terms of the media that have these discussions. But that's not who's, in my experience, who's watching that. I know loads of people in my life who would come up to me and go, "Oh, thank you so much for talking about, the vaccine mandates and all of this." And when I speak to them, my sense is they're not political at all. And they're certainly not right or left wing. So
are you having these conversations at a hipster coffee shop, dude? What are you talking about? Did everyone clap?
With you that the right-wing media grabbed that as an issue and promoted it because it aligns with some of their beliefs. I don't think that's who the audience are. Obviously, I don't have the empirical data to be able to prove this to you, but I'm just going based on my own experience. Sorry to interrupt.
No, that's fine. And I would take the point that there are plenty of people who think there are valid debates to be had about school openings or the length of lockdowns and so on. But I tend to think that, I'm not saying there are no missteps or that there aren't cases where there's a skew towards the government's position on like mainstream media or that kind of thing. But I do think there was a lot of debate about those topics in the media, and like that the media is now such a fractured ecosystem that it was not difficult at all to hear. In fact, if anything, it's more like it was very easy to hear the contrarian takes on things. And that when it comes to like stuff like vaccines, there always has been a vocal minority anti-vaccine movement with Andrew Wakefield, RFK Jr., these figures, right? And typically they're not given mainstream media coverage because their position is not equally well supported. And those figures are now, like, for example, Brett Weinstein headlined an event with RFK Jr. and Del Bigtree and a whole cadre of anti-vaccine figures in the UK. So the linkages between the like modern kind of critical of COVID vaccines is very tied into the anti-vaccine movement. And, in the same way that we don't say we need to give equal hearing to the climate skeptics as the climate scientists, it does feel that you can create a false equivalence by seeking out, the kind of meme is in Joe Rogan's forum, for example, that 9 out of 10 dentists recommend this. Let's get that one dentist and see what he says, right? So,
it's that the meme is like that one dentist must be onto something.
Yeah. Always interviewing the 10th dentist.
That would have been a great name for this show if we didn't do intellectual Dollar Tree, the 10th dentist.
Yeah, I hear you. So first of all, I don't think the equivalency you're making between vaccines that have been tried and tested for 30 years and the current conversation about COVID, not the current conversation, the conversation from around a year ago, are in any way comparable. I don't think they're the same issue at all. There's a big difference between a set of vaccines that's been around for decades and a new vaccine whose long-term consequences we do not, by definition.
Does this guy think that they had just never changed the fucking polio vaccine or the mumps and does he think that these vaccines aren't always being like improved on? Does he think that the vaccine people were like, we got one for measles, we're done now, let's move on to the next thing, never think about measles again or this vaccine? Like that's, you know what I'm saying? I think they're probably all new vaccines. Like every year the flu vaccine is different.
Every single year the flu vaccine is different.
Yeah. They're always
every single year. And I bet you he gets the flu vaccine. So he's trying an untested, unproven vaccine every single year.
And I can't imagine like the MMR vaccine being the same as it was 20 years ago, right? There has to have been. They don't get it, you don't. It's not like on the news and shit because nobody cares because most people already had the MMR vaccine, so you're not going to get it anyway. It doesn't hit the news, but these things have to constantly be being improved upon, evolved, made even safer, made even more effective. Like that has to be the case. He just doesn't know that. I don't know that either, but I can't imagine that not being the case.
But he's also talking about and so many of them talk about this, the long-term effects of these vaccines. And it's like, what do you think the long-term effects could be? Like, there's never been a vaccine that had a long-term effect other than immunity to the disease.
Right. When there have been problems with vaccines, they've been pretty quick, like after they were given, right? When it's been like within a 2-week time frame. Sometimes if you have a reaction, it's like literally right away. Like if you're allergic or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah. And any vaccine has a certain number of side effects, and the side effects don't affect everyone. And you could be allergic to the vaccine. The vaccine could trigger some sort of autoimmune disease that you already have. Vaccines aren't without risk, but every vaccine that has been approved has been less of a risk to take the vaccine than it would be to not take the vaccine and risk getting the disease and then risk the consequences of that disease. Do you know what I mean?
Right, for sure. I mean, he's like hedging here now, and he's like agreeing again. He's like, oh, I don't agree with the anti-vaxxers, or he said, I'm critical of them. Well, what's he doing right now? He's jacking off about the fucking vaccine.
Yep.
So that's the first point I'd make. The second point is I don't think it's true that the contrarian view was represented in the mainstream media at all for the first year or so of the pandemic. I mean, I remember the press conferences Boris Johnson was having where never a single journalist ever questioned him about, have you done some analysis on how many people lockdowns will kill, right? And that is a fundamental input data set that is necessary to make a decision. If you're making a decision between two choices, to go left or to go right, you need to know what are going to be the outcomes of the left one and what are going to be the outcomes of the right one, estimates at least. Otherwise, you cannot make that decision being fully informed.
But wait, okay, so this is dumb. Listen, I fuck Boris Johnson, right? But there's a respiratory disease going around. It looks like you just get it from breathing where people are. So what we're going to do is we're going to try to limit everybody's contact with each other for a while. And then he's asking, well, how many people is that going to kill? And I think it's probably 0.
It's not 0, but it's very close to 0.
Right. I think that like
people don't die of the lockdown. They die of like contributing factors exacerbated by the lockdown. Like if someone is depressed and they're
fair enough,
like forced to remain at home, they might become more suicidal or something.
I also just the media wench has leaned on this the whole time. Nobody was locked down.
Correct. Yeah. By lockdown, what he means is, he's not allowed to go into a crowded movie theater.
Right. He means the stay-at-home suggestion, I call it.
Yeah.
Sauce.
Yeah. And there are places that actually did fucking lock people down.
Right. Right. But those were like China.
Yeah, pretty much only China, I believe.
And they
could be wrong.
per capita, they had a lot less dead people, unless you ask the conspiracy theorists, of course, because the Chinese first invented it, but it's also not real, and you don't need a mask. But the Chinese are like a bunch of them died, and they're not telling you But I just the lockdown is just dumb.
It's a biological weapon, and it killed millions of Chinese people. But also, it's not real.
And we should be able to go to the store.
I don't agree with you.
Well, we should be able to go to the store. I was able to go to the store every day if I wanted.
In terms of Brett and all of this stuff,
I had to pick up my order outside of a Best Buy once. So
chat's disagreeing with us, but I think like New Zealand and Australia just had stricter restrictions, but you could still go to the grocery store, you know.
Conversation, I'm really enjoying it, is you're kind of getting me to defend other people a lot. Whereas I'd prefer that
if you couldn't go outside, that is a lockdown.
All right, I don't want to.
The issue I have with the way we're having this conversation, and I'm really enjoying it, is you're kind of getting me to defend other people a lot. Whereas I'd prefer that you just attack me and I can speak for myself.
But wait, nobody's being attacked. I hate that word. I hate the word being used in this way. I just hate it. Because if you like we're knocking on my door, you're like, I've been attacked, and I'm like, oh, do we need to call the police? You're like, no, actually somebody just said I was wrong.
So actually, yes, call the police.
Brett, I can tell you what I think about Brett. I disagree with Brett's approach to COVID. I also am not qualified to agree or disagree with Brett's approach to COVID, but I instinctively do not agree with the way that he's approached it. At the same time, Brett is a very good friend of mine. He is a man I respect tremendously. Him and Heather are two of the finest human beings that I've ever encountered in my life. And
that doesn't mean they're not grifters. If they're fucking, you have to be like personable in some kind of way, or your grift doesn't work. Like, of course, the people they meet like them. Like, I mean, I wouldn't like them. I don't know. If I met them at a party and didn't know who they were, I might think they were fascinating.
Fortunate to have encountered quite a few very high quality human beings. So I believe in being able to disagree with people about important issues and still appreciate the good qualities. But yeah, if you want to have a go at me personally, I'd probably find that a lot more interesting and easier to have that conversation.
So there's some interesting points, Konstantin.
He's like, because how do you respond to that?
I think the point that you raise at the end about the personal relationships between people is a good point to switch to from the COVID issue. But I just want to respond to one or two of the things that you said, because Matt and I have spent quite a bit of time looking at anti-vaccine rhetoric, and this has been an interest long before COVID. There's papers from 2012 and stuff talking about the kind of tropes that you see in anti-vaccine communities, and I can say with complete confidence that most of the rhetoric that is in the COVID debate is exactly the same as the anti-vaccine rhetoric that you would see 20 or 30 years ago, with the same arguments about it's not all vaccines, it's these vaccines. It's long-term consequences of triple dose MMR vaccines and so on and so forth. And you are right that we cannot know with 100% confidence the long-term consequences of these specific vaccines yet. But billions of people are being dosed. And if there was a genuine danger and the technology was very risky, there is debate about those kind of things. Like, the doctors are not villains wanting to mass murder people. So this would be the greatest controversy ever, right? If that in 20 years, hundreds of thousands of people are dying early and so on. So the clinical trials that were conducted were extensive and they're misrepresented by the anti-vaccine people. But I know, I'm not asking you to get into
sorry,
those
that
details.
isn't, but that is an argument that I'm making with all respect. I was talking about lockdown, if you remember. So in terms of the anti-vaccine stuff, I'm not saying I thought Andrew,
but he did just make that argument,
right? Yeah,
we talked about him making that argument as he was making that argument,
but then he moved on to something else. That's because that they all talk for so long that, like, they wouldn't like talking to me because I would just interrupt them after they said something, because then they'd move on to something else. I'd be like, hold on, can we go back to that other thing you just said? I'd like to. I have a few things I'd like to say about that. They're like in this. They're in this mode because he's always interviewing these people, these kind of galaxy brain type of people. He's like in this mode where he's just fucking talking, and he's like,
yeah, maybe he doesn't even hear what he's saying. And by the time he finishes, he has no recollection of it. Because we literally talked about him making that argument like 3 minutes ago in the video.
It was like 14 hours ago in Headspace time.
Wasn't. And of course, all the people who are anti-vaxxers before are going to be against this particular vaccine. I'm not disputing that at all. What I'm saying is that there were a lot of people like me who were simply saying, is the lockdown the solution to this problem, and is having a second and a third one the solution to this problem? I never got an answer to that. Nobody ever, and I speak to people in government.
Because we don't know. I'm sorry, Konstantin. We don't know.
I mean, to a certain extent, yes, we do know, and it is a solution to that problem. But, you know, he was asking what's the death toll of the lockdown, and we don't know that, but we assume it's going to be less than 2% of the population, which the death toll of COVID was around 2% of the population at that time.
Occasionally,
like 2% of the people who got it. I mean,
how many people did you estimate that lockdowns would kill? And if you can't answer that question,
is he trying to debate about how many people that, like, Chris personally thought the lockdowns would kill? Or does he just mean the big they in the sky?
Does he want an estimate? I'll give an estimate. One in 1,000.
He's not listening, and I don't want to get
1 in a million.
Sure. Maybe
you've made the decision to lock down in the first place, and how on earth could you have made that decision to lock down further? And when I'm talking, by the way, about kill, I'm not talking about the vaccines going around killing people.
It's probably not 3 in 100.
We do have a record in excess deaths at the moment. It's not just suicides. It's cancer treatments that end up being
gross. I was looking right at it when it blinked.
Decades, the consequences of these decisions. And all I wanted, number one, was to have a transparent conversation about that. Number one. Number two, I thought that in the desire to achieve their public health objectives, which is to get everyone vaccinated, blah, 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 blah.
What he's doing here is not answering the fucking, he like went through an anti-vaccine trope, an old one even. And then Chris asked him, he's like, oh, these tropes are all the same. And he's like, I was talking about lockdowns, because he can't fucking, because I think he knows, and he's just going to go back to lockdowns every time.
Yeah. And I know we don't usually bring up chat in the podcast portion, but Core10K in chat brings up a really fucking good point. The death toll of the lockdown needs to be considered with the fewer deaths because people aren't outside. Like
car accidents.
Core10K mentioned car accidents. There were probably a lot fewer car accidents during lockdowns than there were prior or after. So even if the lockdowns had a certain death toll, if it's offset by the number of people who weren't dying in car accidents, then it's effectively zero.
The government attempted in this country, I mean, don't even get me started on Canada and Australia and Germany and Austria, but even in Britain, the government went way too far in attempting to deny people their basic civil liberties and their rights, and attempting to force people to take a vaccine against their will. I mean, I made this point on Joe Rogan.
What do you mean attempted to force? What does that mean? Government agents were not attempting to force people to take the vaccine against their will. Governments were trying to persuade people to take the vaccine.
Maybe he's talking about like the military, where if you didn't take it in the military, they could kick you out.
Yeah, but
they require a lot of vaccines in the military.
You've bought a certain ticket when you join the military, unfortunately.
Yep.
Does it make any sense to anyone that you've got a health minister like Sajid Javid, who is not a medical expert, forcing doctors to have an injection that they don't want to have?
Yes.
Does that make any sense? It makes sense to you?
It does.
Okay, explain to me why that makes sense.
Because the public health procedures are not just decided willy-nilly. And
Yes.
Konstantin, I've heard you in other contexts talk about how people with utopian worldviews about how the world can be perfected, and if we just get the right political system, that's inaccurate representation of human nature, and it can lead to very bad places, right? Utopian worldviews. So you have to price in constantly when you're dealing with government, if you're dealing with public health, that there will be miscommunication, there will be inefficiencies, there will be like miscommunications, right?
Sure.
And so when you price that in, and my experience of the pandemic, it does sound very different to yours, because I did see not only in mainstream media, like politicians being questioned about policies, but also in podcasts with virologists who are very strongly pro-vaccine, debates about what public health measures are appropriate and not, and robust discussions about it. And it was presented as if that was never allowed, but I heard it all over the place. And I heard heterodox people endlessly complaining, Joe Rogan complaining every week about it. And the reality is that you weren't forced to get vaccines, right? Unless you were working in health services or education or government. But
well, you still weren't forced. You could just quit.
Yeah.
And I just want to stop here. People have to do shit. People have to do shit they don't want to do at work all the time.
You were required to, not forced to.
Right. But people do shit that somebody right now is doing some way worse shit than getting a vaccine for some shitty employer right now. Right. Like,
yep. Like if let's say I have a job and part of my job is cleaning the bathrooms. I'm required to clean the bathrooms, but I'm not forced to clean the bathrooms.
Right.
And I don't want to clean the bathrooms.
Right. And shout out to the people who do, by the way. Shout out to people who do that kind of work, because
that's literally a shitty job, and those people are awesome for doing it.
But I would suggest to you that the average like white collar, the target audience of this show, they're going to be like white collar, maybe academics, or like a lot of people in tech probably listen to shows like this. But maybe both of their audiences in a different way are kind of the same. But the audience of this show, they would much rather go get the vaccine than have to go clean the bathroom at their office building, or go clean all the bathrooms, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's just that people don't think about that somebody right now is doing something at a job that would horrify you, and people have to do it all the time. And I think that a lot of the very smart people are so detached from that reality that they don't even consider that when they start thinking about, oh, you've been forced to get the vaccine by your job. And then, and then like some custodian looks over there and goes, the fuck are you talking about? You know what I had to do today? You know what I had to do today? Out of here with your vaccine shit.
Okay. Yeah.
Right. But the reason for that is to avoid vulnerable populations being impacted. So there is a public health rationale for it, and individual doctors saying, well, I don't want to do that. That is their right to do so. But you can't say that if you have a regulation where, like, if a doctor says, I don't believe that I need to clean my hands in order to stop viruses spreading, and he's medically trained, you don't say, well, he's got reasons for.
How many doctors are doing that, though?
Well, yeah, but
but this is the point.
Hold on, wait. Pause this, because this is actually really interesting. There were doctors that refused to do that.
Yeah, I forget what I heard.
Like, no joke. Back when we were discovering germ theory, there were doctors who refused to wash their hands. And what do you think fucking happened to them? They're not doctors anymore. Oh,
right.
Well, I mean, they're dead now, but at the time, they weren't doctors anymore.
They eventually lost their license. Yeah, there were nurses. Yeah. Though there was all kinds of medical professionals before we understood germ theory, and then there were germ theory deniers, and those people. I don't know how long it took or whatever. There was no Twitter, so I can't go back and look and see what they're arguing about. But I bet there was like weird, like fucking conspiracy debate about that shit too. And those doctors eventually were just quacks.
Yep. And this guy's acting like this is some like ridiculous, far-fetched scenario, but that's actually literally happened.
Yeah.
It wasn't 0.0000001% of doctors saying, I don't want to have this vaccine. It was quite a lot of them. And we were going to lose a lot of medical staff.
It actually was a fairly small number.
4.5 months ago, several of the nurses or the midwives rather, who helped to deliver him in private told me that they were not vaccinated and that they were going to leave the National Health Service if they were forced to do it. So I'm not just talking based on just, something I invented in my head. I'm telling you, there were
what a weird thing to privately tell someone.
Medically qualified who did not want anything to do with this vaccine. Now,
but this is a story that we just have to take his word on.
Yeah, it's like it's such a strange story too. Like. These people pulled me aside. They said, "Sir, this is a very strange thing for me to tell you, but I'm not vaccinated, and I don't want to be forced to be vaccinated. So if they're going to force me to be vaccinated, I'm going to leave."
Did or didn't?
Why are you telling me this?
Different issue. My point to you is
maybe they knew who he was.
Situation where
his channel's not unpopular.
Doctors and medical experts.
Maybe if they're like anti-vaxxers or whatever, they would probably maybe know about him.
Want to have a vaccine. I don't think it makes any sense for that.
That's crazy to think about how skewed his version of reality is. Him thinking like, oh, someone came up to me and said this, and like his view is like, that's just a random person coming up and telling me this. So like that many just random people, out of all people, it's this many people that believe this.
It's
when really like, no, it's not just random people. It's a very selected group.
They all do this.
It's a pre-selected group.
They all do this. If like Brett and Heather do this too, where they say they talk to someone, right?
Mm-hmm.
And even if it's a random person, yeah, they're famous enough that enough people know who they are, that the people who are going to come up to them are likely to either, I don't know, tell them to go fuck themselves, or come up and tell them some weird anti-vax story they have.
Yep.
Be enforced upon them, particularly when we don't have any evidence that the vaccine was hugely effective at preventing transmission from one person to another.
Yeah, but the vaccine has proved extremely, like when we're talking about the impacts of COVID, right? The death statistics and stuff make it very clear that this did lead to excess deaths across the world, a large impact on public health services and medical facilities, and transmission. The way that it's often presented I find in the heterodox sphere is as if the vaccines are, practically useless and do nothing. But when you look at the
I don't think that at all.
I'm not saying
that's literally how he was presenting it 30 seconds ago.
Well, to be fair, it was nurses, and he was saying that the government shouldn't ever tell a nurse what to do, which is weird because they have to follow so many fucking regulations as part of their job.
I mean, he just presented that way by saying that we had no evidence that it prevents transmission. And, he's responding saying like, yes, many people present the vaccine as if it was ineffective. And he's like, I didn't say that.
But yeah, even though he
essentially just said that.
Yeah.
Relatively less effective with later strains, right? With the earlier vaccines. But in most cases, not on a par, just less effective. And when it comes to stopping the spread amongst the population of the virus, public health has to take something of a one-size-fits-all approach.
I mean, I'm sure you think that, but I disagree with this completely. I mean, this argument can be used to push all sorts of tyranny onto the population because if the interest... Hold on a second. Let me answer your point.
Yes, it can, but it's not necessarily going to. And like, this is the idea of like, oh, if we pass a law that allows us to mitigate this risk, then we'll start mitigating non-risks and eventually we'll be the Nazis. It's like, it is just a slippery slope fallacy. That's all I can say is it's literally just a slippery slope fallacy.
Of the nation require some sort of health measure. I mean, we've got to protect the NHS. Why don't we just shoot obese people? They are the real
What the
epidemic.
fuck?
They're the ones that are doing it. How far do you take restrictions
What?
of people's civil liberties and forcing?
I mean, no, we're not. Okay, going around and fucking checking somebody's BMI and then blatting them isn't. I would maybe not say that. Okay, yeah, it's a violation of your civil liberty, but I don't think that that's how I would describe that.
I wonder what would happen to the death statistics if you did that. My guess is they would go up.
Right, because you're going around shooting people.
To inject stuff in their body. Why don't we invent a vaccine for obesity and force fat people to take it? Almost everybody in our society would completely agree that that would be unethical. Forcing people to have an injection, they
But
don't want
again, like people weren't forced. They were required because they had to keep their job or wanted to fucking, I don't know, continue to volunteer at the local middle school or whatever. But that's
also I'm gonna this is like really hard to understand, but I'm gonna try and break it down into like the simplest medical terms I can. Being fat is not contagious.
would be considered unethical in any
That's fucking why, Konstantin.
when everyone shits the bed over COVID.
So how about childhood vaccination for things like polio and tuberculosis, which are not optional?
I'm in favor of it, and I want my son to have it.
Why? Why? But why?
Because I think those vaccines would be advantageous to him.
But if they are not mandated, like childhood vaccination, and you choose not to have it for your kid, and the polio virus comes back, or your child gets polio and is badly injured, so your preference would be that we don't mandate any vaccinations for any diseases and allow them to return, or is it specifically COVID?
I think it's slightly different with children because children are incapable of making that decision for themselves. We're talking about adults. So if we're talking about adults in the context of COVID, I don't think COVID vaccines should ever be mandated, no.
But just COVID vaccines. So you do think there are circumstances where if the disease is infectious enough or debilitating enough that it could be right to mandate it in order to keep immunity and to protect children?
I think for me the issue is less about the disease, although obviously that's a factor. I don't think it'd be stupid to pretend otherwise. If Ebola had the levels of spread of COVID, we'd be having a different conversation, although I don't think you'd need to force a lot of people to take it because they'd be taking it themselves. But it's, for me, the issue is
you would think, but let me tell you,
for them, and that's a bit different. So that would be the difference for me. But my point is something else, which is the taking away of people all sorts of rights that people normally have during COVID. That was the thing that annoyed me. And those were the principles that I thought were being violated, that I thought were important to stand up for, which is why, again, I encourage you to ask me about my views as opposed to defending people who think the vaccine is, a 5G plot or whatever the hell that is.
Well, that's as good a place as any, I think, to stop this because we're almost an hour and a half in and I haven't had a drink yet. So it's frustrating because there was a couple times where Konstantin said something and Chris was like, "You said this?" He's like, "No, I didn't."
Yeah, that happened twice. That was, and I wish he did push back, but maybe he just didn't catch it that is exactly what Konstantin was doing. But yeah,
or it's just that he's just a different person than you and me, and he's just not. That's not like his. Like he just isn't as likely to be like directly confrontational as we are. And that's fine. Chris and Matt do pretty good work on their show. We are going to listen to the rest of this during the post game because this is pretty good. Just a couple takeaways. Konstantin isn't really good in an environment where somebody's like questioning him about what he's doing and who he's chosen to associate with. It's pretty clear to me that he did not like being questioned about like what he was platforming on his fairly popular YouTube channel. It's clear that he does not want to have that particular discussion. But his show isn't really about himself or what he thinks. It's about his guests. He has his guests on and that's what draws the people in. So he doesn't give his position very much. He just platforms people with what I would think are generally the bad positions and or unfunny people who are mad that they can't be comedians anymore because they're unfunny.
You're thinking of the host.
No, I'm thinking of some of their recent guests who they've been kind of leaning hard on the can't do comedy thing lately. So they have a bunch of unfunny fucking people like Adam Carolla on.
Yeah, there you go. You're right about that.
Adam Carolla has not been funny since Loveline. Anyway, HK, you want to read the show out?
All right. Thank you so much for listening. If you're watching on Twitch, you're going to catch the red light right after the song we play. And if you're listening on the podcast and you'd like to come watch us on Twitch, we stream this show live every Wednesday night at 7 p.m. That's Pacific time. Check us out at echoplexmedia.com. We have a lot of other shows, including a show we do we put it out right before this show every Wednesday. And it's on YouTube, and it's called How the Tech Are You? It's like a tech news show. And we also just recently launched a new Mastodon instance called port87.social. So if you want to go follow us on Mastodon, I'm at HParron, and Dave is at Dave. So check us out there. If you want to donate to us, it's patreon.com/Echoplex. And this is Boomers by Periscope.